Major and significant resignations from the Justice Department spanning the headquarters in Washington and New York, a key office that you might recall has been in the news a lot whenever Donald Trump has come near the presidency. So we're going to go through it. You may have heard some aspects of this, and we actually have more news here just late in the day. So within the last few moments, we have gotten new developments. The baseline story is 3 more senior officials in the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, which is famed for its nonpartisanship and dealing with sensitive and difficult cases, prosecuting potentially officials and party members from Republican to Democrat without fear or favor. These new officials from that section, which I'm telling you is important, resigned following a meeting with the acting Deputy Attorney General dealing in the New York City mayor case. That's according to sources who've spoken with NBC News. That's late in the day and brings the total up now to 6 resignations here today. It began late today when the acting head of the Southern District of New York resigned. That's that SDNY office that you've heard about before. It's been a flashpoint for Donald Trump even before he ever became president the first time. This resignation came just days after an unusual and, according to many sources, improper interference from headquarters at Trump DOJ now to drop or basically back off what was a corruption case against the sitting New York mayor, Eric Adams. So Danielle R. Sassoon resigned in a letter sent to the new Attorney General under Donald Trump, Pam Bondi. Now, she has been a Republican. She is a respected lawyer. You can see her there in New York. And she once clerked for one of the more conservative members on the Supreme Court in the last several decades, the late Justice Antonin Scalia. She also drew headlines for all kinds of cases that have nothing to do with politics and shouldn't, prosecuting Sam Bankman-Fried's multi-billion-dollar crypto fraud. After her resignation, the Trump DOJ moved this case against the New York mayor over to Washington's Public Integrity Unit. And if it continued there, that might be normal or okay. But that then led to another bombshell, raising questions about whether it was moved for this purpose or only to get headquarters in Washington and the new Trump people to have more control. Because top officials there also resigned. Here's how the Times puts it. The resignations represent the most high-profile public resistance so far to President Trump's tightening control over the Justice Department. Now, before the resignation, Sassoon, that official I mentioned, sent a very clear letter to the DOJ describing, at least on the Mayor Adams side, a type of potential or pursued bribe, an exchange, what is sometimes in law called a quid pro quo, and that it was proposed between the New York mayor and Trump officials. The accusation was that he said he would help more with Trump's immigration agenda if the charges got dropped. Quote, rather than be rewarded. Adams' advocacy should be called out for what it is, she writes. An improper offer of immigration enforcement assistance in exchange for dismissal of his case. It is a breathtaking and dangerous precedent, she writes, to reward Adams' opportunistic and shifting commitments on immigration and other policy matters with dismissal of a criminal indictment. And I'm going to read from this here more because this is such an unusual letter to get in any administration. And she sounds both concerned and quite candid. She says, and remember, this is a longtime Republican official who has done nonpartisan work under her obligations at DOJ, but I leave this on the screen for you to see, quote, I remain baffled by the rushed and superficial process by which this decision was reached. Now, I want to be clear, these are open cases. Mayor Adams is legally presumed innocent. That trial was going to happen in the future. Now you can see the case all but being backed off of. Adams' lawyer denies, however, that allegation of any, quote, quid pro quo. Now, in response to the resignation, the DOJ is going at her and her staff, the deputy AG, writing back, prosecutors principally responsible for the case are being placed on off-duty administrative leave pending investigations. That is a word that can refer to gathering more facts, but since Attorney General Pam Bondi has lately ordered investigations of others deemed Trump critics or perceived opponents or enemies, the talk of new DOJ investigations, while they're being criticized by one of their own, adds to the flavor of this being a huge and growing scandal for Trump at DOJ. And I want to be clear with you. There's been a lot of talk in these first few weeks of the second Trump administration about what is distraction or what is flooding the zone and which things do you cover. We have very key evidence that this, unlike an Elon Musk press conference in the White House, is not what the Trump administration wants driving the headlines. That these resignations now mounting make it much harder to claim what they're doing is somehow just orderly DOJ business. It rather looks like, from nonpartisan experts to career officials to some Republican officials, they have a scandal on their hands already as they try to do the thing that many people warned about, that we've covered here, that we've heard from experts about, that they would abuse federal power, DOJ powers, in exactly this type of manner. Another sign that they don't want this in the headlines and that they know it's incriminating seeming at a minimum is that President Trump isn't claiming some credit for this on a revenge tour. Here is exactly his exchange asked about this breaking news scandal at DOJ right now.
The U.S. Attorney has resigned over the DOJ's request to drop the case into Eric Adams. Did you personally request the Justice Department to drop that case?
No, I didn't. I know nothing about it. To your other question, that U.S. Attorney was actually fired. I don't know if he or she resigned, but that U.S. Attorney was fired.
We shared with you the breaking news, the letters, the facts first, and the DOJ's written response. None of that suggests that the official I mentioned was fired. So that statement would appear, based on current materials that we have from Trump's own DOJ officials, to be false. Trump also said he knows, quote, nothing about the Adams case. It is a case, and dealing with the mayor, that he and his aides have been well aware of. It's been a huge story in New York. There have been other reports about the posture towards the case. So, again, I want to be clear. The claim by the president that he knows, quote, nothing about it doesn't square with the history. You could say it sounds like rhetoric, and sometimes politicians speak more freely. But there were several problems even in the short statement that the president gave there, and also an indication that he doesn't want to be seen, politically or otherwise, as involved in this. Now, I told you the Southern District matters. You might remember the term. There are many different federal districts around the country. But the New York Southern District matters for many reasons. Geographically, you're dealing with a very big financial and terror target of Manhattan, and you're dealing with a lot of high-profile individuals. It has also been renowned because of exactly the type of cases it takes and the type of lawyers it has traditionally recruited for a type of independence that has really been proclaimed and touted by many different officials. If you watch MSNBC long enough, you've seen former SDNY officials on our air. But Donald Trump had a problem with that independence. He did fire 2 U.S. attorneys in that office. You can see now, adding the recent resignation, Preet Bharara, Geoffrey Berman, who was a Republican initially closer to the Trump DOJ, and then today, the acting U.S. attorney in that same district. I want to remind you, because it matters tonight in understanding the suspicions and the scandal of something that really is bogging down the Trump administration right now. It was in late 2016, all the way back when this man walked into Trump Tower in the lobby. That was Preet Bharara. He had been serving in that job from a prior Democratic administration. And interestingly, then President-elect Trump, we later learned, told Bharara he would keep him on the job. Why would he keep a Democratic holdover in New York? Well, a lot of reporting since then, and that was Bharara talking to reporters in that unusual meeting, because incoming presidents don't usually meet with the over 90 U.S. attorneys from the prior administration. But it became clear that Trump thought he could exert even more pressure on someone who might just be hoping to hold on to that job. They clashed. Trump fired Bharara within a few months. He did not resign. In 2020, Trump fired Berman, who actually had dealt with cases that Donald Trump had a vested interest in. He prosecuted Trump attorney Michael Cohen. He was dealing with an investigation into Rudy Giuliani. There are many different offices, and there are many, many different places that we're covering, from DOJ on out to the whole federal government right now. But this is not an accident. There is a reason, and according to a lot of the evidence we have, a suspicious reason why President Trump is again refocused on this office, and why even former longtime officials and Republicans are objecting to his first big foray through the DOJ to use this office.
Welcome back. The Senate Budget Committee passed a resolution Wednesday focusing on immigration and defense. It moved ahead along party lines, 11-10, as Republicans moved to push forward President Trump's priorities. Joining me now is the top Democrat on the Senate Budget Committee, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, who also serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thank you for joining us. From the Senate Democrat view on the Budget Committee, is this the approach that you think Republicans are ultimately going to go with as they try to accomplish their reconciliation goals?
Well, what we're seeing is them using defense and homeland security as a Trojan horse, because the real goal here is to provide an avenue through which they can then do, as the House said yesterday, some $1.5 to $2 trillion in cuts to spending on programs families depend on healthcare and housing and education and childcare. These fundamentals that let families stand on their feet and move with vigor into the middle class. That's their target. And it's produce, if you will, some of the money, cut the programs for families, produce some of the money that's going to go to tax cuts for the billionaires. They're talking about $4.5 trillion. So let's do the basic math here. Let's say $2 trillion in spending cuts to family programs, $4.5 trillion in giveaways, mostly to billionaires. And what do you have in between there? You have borrowing of $2.5 to $3 trillion. So it's a three-part plan: cut programs for families, enrich the richest Americans, and run up the debt. That's what they're doing, but they want to give it a veneer of respectability, and that's to talk about homeland security and defense. Those are things that would be done in the normal appropriations process with bipartisan support. They're being used here as the smokescreen to cover up this assault on families, this run up of the debt, and this strategy of giving away the nation to the billionaires.
Because we're talking here about potential cuts if these reconciliation plans go through to programs like SNAP, like Medicaid, like student loan debt forgiveness, some of those key Democratic priorities from prior legislation that was passed in recent years. But with your party in the minority in both the House and the Senate, is there any opportunity to get Democratic priorities into these kinds of packages? I know that reconciliation is really a partisan process to begin with.
It's a 100% partisan process,
which Democrats
now.
have used as of recently.
Yes, and you know, we have used it always to reduce the deficit, which is what it was created for in 1974, with one exception, and that's when our economy was collapsing under COVID, and we needed to produce programs to help the small businesses stay alive, programs stay alive, states stay afloat during the COVID collapse. But now what we see is every time the Republicans are in power, they're using this filibuster-free pathway that was created to reduce the deficit to do the opposite, to give tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans and run up the debt. To your question about our priorities, well, what we're going to see is our priorities are going to be attacked, and we're going to illuminate those. And we're going to illuminate it with the goal of mobilizing people across this country, because this is not what Trump campaigned on. He didn't campaign on cutting community health centers and making drugs more expensive and housing more expensive and Head Start more difficult and school lunches more rare or the cost of college higher. He didn't campaign on those things. So here we have the great betrayal. He campaigned on helping families, but now we see the real strategy: attack the programs for families that are necessary for families to stand on their feet and thrive, and give away the bank to the richest Americans. And we're going to oppose it. We're going to publicize it. We're going to stall it. We're going to create as many wedges and divisions as we can, because this is not in the interest of government by and for the people. This is government by and for the billionaires.
And we've also seen Democrats take similar efforts to try to gum up the process. You are in the minority. You're not afforded many ways of pushing back, but one of them is on the floor overnight for the RFK Jr. nomination. I think there's been a conversation in Washington about that's how you'll proceed on reconciliation. But then when it comes to government funding, the appropriations process, or whether it's kicking the can down the road ahead of March 14th, that government funding deadline, there's been a lot of talk about Democrats saying, well, they might be willing to shut down the government as a leverage point. I guess my question is...
Republicans.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Allie, it's the Republicans in charge. If the government shut down, it's because the government in charge shuts it down, and because they're pursuing ends that we simply can't support. But it's the Republicans who have to decide.
But I think the conversation around Democrats using that as a leverage point because it's on the calendar, what would you use it for leverage on?
Well, listen, it's never going to be business as usual when the president is breaking the law every single day. I mean, these are not questions of, a little bit of gray area about where executive power meets congressional power. For example, President Biden was criticized over his student loan forgiveness program. There was a legal case to say it was possible. There's another legal case to say it wasn't. It had to be done by the courts. It was a gray area. But what we're seeing now, for example, in the firing of the inspector generals, it's absolutely clear. The law says you cannot fire them without 30 days notice and without cause. That's to protect the integrity of the executive branch. So this law breaking and then this withholding of funds, that is not just breaking the law, that's unconstitutional. That is the power of the purse. That's an authoritarian president. And we're going to stand against the complete undermining of the vision of the separation of powers and the checks and balances. That's the difference between a democracy and a dictator.
Senator Jeff Merkley, so many more topics that I would have asked you about, but time is against us on this one. Thank you for joining us.
Sitting down the table at the next cabinet meeting from Emile Bove will be Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He was sworn in as Donald Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services after a career and global infamy, really, of attacking vaccines and other health measures. He now leads America's public health infrastructure, which is already under assault by the Trump administration. All but one Republican senator voted for him to confirm him, and that was Senator Mitch McConnell, who survived childhood polio. In a statement, Mitch McConnell said he refuses to condone the relitigation of proven cures. Several of his Republican colleagues expressed that same concern, but still voted to confirm Robert Kennedy today. This followed 2 days of confirmation hearings that proved to anyone watching that Kennedy is unprepared to answer some basic questions about science and the responsibilities of the job. Joining us, former White House COVID-19 response coordinator under President Biden and the dean of Brown University School of Public Health, Dr. Ashish Jha is here, plus former Obama White House policy director and MSNBC medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel is here. Dr. Jha, there are all the reasons that he was dangerous to health that Mitch McConnell articulates around vaccines, especially the polio vaccine. And there was the indictment of his character from a family member, something I've never seen in my entire career. His cousin Caroline called him a predator and blamed him for leading other family members toward the path of addiction. How did this happen?
So, Nicole, first of all, thanks for having me back. I mean, I think the reality is, as many of us have been saying for a long time, Robert F. Kennedy is wildly unqualified for this job. And now that he is in the job, we will have to hold him accountable because he is going to oversee the infrastructure that is necessary for protecting the health of the American people. This is not just about vaccines for kids. It's about Medicare for the elderly, a program he seems to know nothing about. It's a whole host of things that we rely on. And unfortunately, this is a man who has proven to date that he is unpersuadable by science, evidence, and data. Obviously, we're all going to hope that that changes.
What does that even look like?
Well, Nicole, it's a very good question. I mean, in the hearings, he said, hey, look, if I see any data that vaccines are safe, I'll be open-minded about it. Like, what data is he looking for? There is just so much data out there that he has continued to ignore. Nothing about his hearings gave me any confidence that this is somebody who's going to change his behavior after 30 years of casting doubt on proven cures, as Senator McConnell said. I think the consequences here could be quite catastrophic. And we will all have to speak up and push back and work with reasonable members of Congress across the political spectrum to make sure that he's held accountable if his policies lead to real harm to children.
I mean, we're going to have to go back to relying on folks like yourself. And so I hope you will answer our calls to be here. I'm sorry for the delay. As Chris Hayes sort of pulled back the curtain on our process, we were delayed in having this conversation because of breaking news, but we appreciate you talking to us, Dr. Jha. Dr. Patel, I think, have sat through the slow motion car wreck that is the right, sort of casting aspersions on known knowns when it comes to science and data, and specifically vaccines. The tragedy is that if your kid is sick or your parent is sick, it doesn't matter where you get your news, and it doesn't matter who you voted for. You just want them to be healthy and well again. What are your concerns, sort of beyond any of the fractured politics, about people's ability to trust their doctors and trust the science?
Well, it's one of those abilities is being undermined right now. We're in the midst of one of the worst kind of flu epidemics I've ever seen. And there's a lot of questions about why it's happening, including some under-vaccination in parts of the country, Nicole. But we've got deaths that are following. It's affecting everyone. I bet everybody watching this knows at least one or two, or even themselves, people have been diagnosed with the flu. But as clinicians, we're flying blind a little bit because we can't really trust that the sources from the CDC, especially when they're being told not to give us information, that we can't really trust what's coming even out of the government right now, because sometimes, some weeks, for 2 weeks in January, there was no information coming out of the government. So that translates to real lack of clarity, real lack of trust. And unfortunately, that translates to lives being lost. So it's happening right now. And I feel for the staff. I mean, I can't tell you how many career staff have been calling and trying to understand what's going to happen to them. These are the same staff putting together our flu surveillance protocols. They're the ones that put the data up. And they're worried that they're on some list, or they have already been put on a list because of some sort of watchdog. So it's happening right now. And I think that, unfortunately, Nicole, this isn't just this administration problem. If you take down this infrastructure, or you put an undermined trust in the very thing that it didn't matter what politics we have as doctors that we depend on, then we've undermined several generations.
Let's talk about these and a whole lot of other developments. Richard Haass, President Emeritus at the Council of Foreign Relations. And Richard, I really appreciate you being with me. There is so much to talk about. But I want to focus first on the issue between Hamas and Israel. There was the President of the United States said just a couple of days ago that if all the hostages weren't released by this next Saturday, all hell could break loose. How do you see that tactic? And it seems as though Hamas may be saying, well, we're going to be releasing some of the hostages on Saturday after they had expressed doubts.
They probably will. The Israelis are having special meetings prepared to resume military action as soon as the weekend. My guess is the first phase of this agreement will continue to happen. By the way, a lot of prisoners will be released. The numbers are far in that direction. And then the question is what happens next? Phase 2 gets more complicated because you need complete Israeli military withdrawal. You would have to have an open-ended ceasefire. I think that's I'm more skeptical of that, Jose. And I think Hamas may decide they're not going to be the problem. Maybe let Israel be the problem, because there are still real issues of difference between Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government.
And then you have the whole issue of Gaza and what happens in Gaza going forward. The President of the United States also throwing out this idea, it seemed out of the blue for many, of the United States having the United States Authority take the Gaza Strip and redevelop it and move up to 2 million Palestinians from there. How does that play?
Well, the short answer is that's not going to happen. But what's interesting is that the other possible explanation for Hamas showing a little bit of flexibility in the hostage exchange is the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and others are talking about how to respond to this Trump proposal that none of them wants, none of them likes. And it's quite possible they told Hamas, let's keep the focus on this. And let's keep the focus on what happens and come up with an alternative, if you will, to mass deportation. Let's come up with a governance and security and political proposal for Gaza. And my guess is that's where Hamas and the rest of the Arabs are going to be going.
Why has this not been considered or talked about before?
This being
the pan-Arab talks have been going on, but this specific issue is something that nobody had talked about before.
Well, there had been a little bit of talk. Obviously, the Saudis had said, if you want us to normalize with Israel, we need a day-after plan. We need something about a Palestinian state. I think what happened is the Trump proposal, though, scrambled the eggs completely. You saw the discomfort of the Jordanian king when he was in the Oval Office the other day. He said he wants to talk to his Egyptian counterpart. So I think that's what's happening, is that the Trump introduction of this outside idea has changed the political dynamics, and I think the Arabs basically have come to the point of view, you can't beat something with nothing. So I think now they want to come up with something in a hurry.
Richard, the importance and the significance of Saudi Arabia in all of this, there was clearly discussions, talks underway before October 7th between Saudi Arabia, Israel. Certainly the United States, the Biden administration was involved in that. All these things changed afterwards, but the importance of Saudi, and also the historic importance of Egypt, which, if you look at it, really doesn't seem to play any geopolitical importance, but its history certainly gives it, and then the King of Jordan as well.
Look, Egypt was the first Arab country to establish peace with Israel. It's about a quarter of the Arab world in terms of demography.
Right.
It's lost, though, a lot of its political weight to the Saudis and others who have the economic power. Saudis also have the holy places of Islam. And in some ways, they've taken over leadership to the extent it exists in the Arab world. The UAE also has a big role. Jordan's important simply because it's next to Israel. It's probably, 60% Palestinian now. It was the second Arab country to establish peace with Israel. And I don't think the Israelis want to destabilize either Jordan or Egypt. So in some ways, they're a little bit uneasy with some of these threats of deportation because of what it might do in the neighborhood. So again, I think what's so interesting about the Trump proposal is not that it's going to happen, is what it might set in motion in response to it.
Do you see any reason to be optimistic in this?
Words like optimism and Middle East rarely get uttered in the same sentence or paragraph. Look, I think, though, there are some reasons to be optimistic. The military situation in the region has so shifted, given the weakening of Hamas, the weakening of Hezbollah, the disappearance of the Syrian regime.
Iran being so effective.
Iran. So I think there's real diplomatic openings with Iran to maybe get a nuclear deal. President Trump has talked about that on more than one occasion, what he calls a verifiable nuclear agreement. And second of all, there ought to be possibilities on the Israeli-Palestinian front, again, for the reasons we're talking about. If people don't like the Trump proposal, and I think for good reason, Hamas is weakened militarily, Iran is weakened, there's an opening here. And the real question, I think, is whether Israelis are willing to seize it and whether you can find Palestinians, enough of them, who are willing to stand up and offer an alternative to the violence and terror of Hamas. So there is, optimism maybe is too strong a word, possibilities, absolutely.
Richard Haass, it's great seeing you. I thank you very much for being with us this morning.
A country in Russia's position could allow them, just in their position, could allow them to join NATO. I don't see that happening.
When Putin says that he really wants peace, do you believe him?
Yeah, I do. I believe he wants peace. I'd love to have him back. I think it was a mistake to throw him out. Look, it's not a question of liking Russia or not liking Russia. It was the G8. And, I said, what are you doing? You guys, all you talk about is Russia, and they should be sitting at the table. I think Putin would love to be back.
Stunning comments coming from an American president sitting in the Oval Office today. President of the United States making remarks that sound much more like they were written by folks sitting in the Kremlin than the man or woman elected to sit behind the resolute desk. Donald Trump's comments come after he spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where the two leaders discussed starting negotiations to end the war in Ukraine immediately. The call was a shocking development that left our European friends and allies scrambling. A European official telling NBC News that NATO allies were, quote, blindsided. Germany's defense minister said the call was regrettable. France's defense minister said this, quote, this was a real moment of political truth, and warned that, quote, peace through weakness could have dramatic security implications in the region. But for Russia, the call was cause for celebration. It was a recognition by the United States of America that it hadn't enjoyed for years now. Following the call, Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, said this, quote, they're drinking vodka straight out of the bottle in the Kremlin tonight, end quote. And even though Trump called Ukrainian President Zelensky after he talked to Putin, there are major concerns that Ukraine will be left out of whatever negotiations actually happen, a worry Trump didn't alleviate when asked about it yesterday.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace. I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
It wasn't a yes. Wow. Joining us now, New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley. Also joining us, professor of history at New York University, Ruth Ben-Ghiat is here. Michael Crowley, I've heard the word Neville Chamberlain-like appeasement. Tell me what you're picking up from national security sources.
Yeah, well, Nicole, that is one of the big reactions that we're hearing, which is, head scratching over President Trump's approach to this negotiation, which is to say that from the outset, he is making key concessions to the Russians over the fate of Ukraine. And one of them is to say that the U.S. is dropping its support for Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO, which is a longstanding U.S. position. You also heard Secretary of Defense Hegseth say that it was unrealistic to expect that Ukraine would return to its pre-2014 borders, which not only includes land that was taken by Russia in the invasion that occurred in February of 2022, but really refers to the annexation of Crimea in early 2014. So essentially saying that we're giving up on Crimea. Now, you might say that it was going to be very difficult to get Crimea back, but at least it was something that you could negotiate with, as is NATO membership. But I think there's a sense that when Trump comes out of the gate like this, making big concessions, people are wondering, how much does he really care about Ukraine's interests? I mean, in general, beyond that particular point, Nicole, there's just a kind of a lack of empathy or concern from President Trump when he talks about this conflict and talks about Ukraine for the fate of Ukraine. It's really, his focus is overwhelmingly on the U.S.-Russia relationship, on his relationship with Vladimir Putin, his ability to get a deal done. And you just hear very little about what it means for Ukraine, how it looks for Ukraine, and how much he cares about the future of Ukraine.
I mean, Ruth, it's not just about Ukraine. It's about U.S. national security. Here's Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, making those points.
And this is a palpable harm to American national security, because what Hegseth and Trump did today was not only blow up the NATO position on Ukraine, they blew up a thing called the Belavasia Accords that Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia signed in December of 1991 that broke up the Soviet Union along the lines of the internal republics. So it means that not only is unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine now okay, every other former republic in the Soviet Union is vulnerable to the same thing without any indication that the U.S. will do anything about it.
You know, my sort of consumption of your book and Tim Snyder's and this affinity and this reflexive attraction to autocrats is predicated on isolationism, right? Or it never happens without Americans turning inward. And I wonder what you think about whether or not there'll be any public outcry when Americans start to see Ukrainians suffer at the hands of Vladimir Putin's Russia.
I mean, they've been suffering at the hands of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and President Trump had an interesting, he said it in the clip you showed, it wasn't a good war to go into. He did not say it wasn't a good decision by Vladimir Putin to have this aggression against Ukraine. And, you know, I mean, President Trump is very clear. He has a long history of sympathy for Vladimir Putin, and he has repeatedly blamed former President Biden for provoking Putin by supporting, you know, Ukraine's NATO bid to join NATO. And this is classic Kremlin thinking. President Trump often echoes Kremlin talking points, as does Tulsi Gabbard, who was just confirmed as his director of national intelligence. These are people who truly see democracies as the problem. And I don't know why people are so surprised. President Trump, during the campaign, was very clear in June in Virginia at a rally. He said, if you have a smart president, they're not your enemies. You're going to make them do great. And he was referring to Russia, China, and North Korea. He has a long history of sympathy toward autocratic leaders. These are his role models. And so this isn't an isolationism. This isn't a retreat. This is the American people should be prepared that under Trump, they are going to be allies with murderous dictators whose countries are criminal entities. Russia is a kleptocracy. So there's no surprise if you study autocrats in this very regrettable turn of affairs.
Ambassador McFaul has joined our conversation, former ambassador to Russia and MSNBC international affairs analyst. Ambassador McFaul, your thoughts today on what is, one, strategically inept, negotiating in public with Vladimir Putin, two, morally bankrupt, leaving our friends and allies in Ukraine in the cold, and three, being compared to Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement.
Well, Nicole, I'm in Munich right now, speaking of the last Munich agreement. And I can tell you, speaking to European leaders and speaking to Ukrainian leaders today, everybody here is in shock. They knew and they studied what President Trump said, but they did not believe that he would begin this negotiation, which, by the way, the Ukrainians supported by giving Putin everything he wanted before the negotiation started, just to echo what you just said. I mean, I negotiated with the Russians. I negotiated several different treaties with them. And I can tell you that if you give them something, they're going to put it in their pocket and ask for more. And so to say Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO and Ukraine needs to give territory and American troops won't be part of any peacekeeping, those are three giant concessions that they said in public before the negotiations started. And I can tell you that the Ukrainians and other European leaders here in Munich are in shock.
What happens next, Ambassador McFaul?
What happens next is President Zelensky will show up here. He should have his bilateral meeting with the vice president and other people on the Trump team. And my hope, and I know it's the hope of the Ukrainians and Europeans as well, is that they'll begin to negotiate with the negotiators about how you go about doing business with Vladimir Putin. Number one, you don't meet and do a deal with the Ukrainians not part of it. Number two, you don't do a deal without the Europeans part of it, expecting that they're going to play all kinds of roles that you have in mind for them. And number three, I think there's some hope that after this bad start, that they might get into a better rhythm that ultimately will be decided. What at the end of the day, the negotiation is between Russia and Ukraine. It's not between Trump and Putin. And I hope that their expectation is that they might educate the American counterparts that will be here tomorrow about that fact. That is a fact. There is no deal unless the Ukrainians sign up to the deal. And they're not going to sign up to a deal that President Trump just negotiates with Putin and then sends them an email. I guarantee you they will not accept that.
You know,